They tell it like scripture. A handful of ragged colonists cross a black ocean, land on a stone slick with November frost, and from that single footstep grows the freest nation the world has ever seen. Farmers become generals. Printers become philosophers. 13 bickering colonies become one indivisible republic, blessed, they say, not by kings or armies, but by Providence itself. This is the story America tells about its own birth. It is a story of liberty bursting fully formed from the forehead of history, of ordinary men transformed into founding demigods, of a city upon a hill visible to the whole watching world. It is inspiring. It is quoted in classrooms, carved into monuments, recited at every inauguration. And like most sacred stories, it is not quite the truth. It is something more powerful and more dangerous. It is the truth America chose to remember, polished smooth of every uncomfortable edge. Tonight, we do not tear the myth down. We open it up and look at what is actually inside, the real men, the real fear, the real blood, and ask why a nation needed a legend this clean to survive. In the winter of 1620, a battered ship called the Mayflower found itself off a coastline it had never intended to reach. It was carrying just over 100 people. Separatist believers seeking freedom from religious persecution, along with tradesmen, servants, and children hoping only for a livelihood. They had aimed for the mouth of the Hudson River. Storms and navigational error pushed them instead toward the rocky shoulder of Cape Cod. What happened next has been told and retold so many times in American classrooms that the retelling itself has become more real than the event. The signing of a compact aboard the ship, promising self-government under just and equal laws. The first brutal winter in which roughly half the passengers died of cold, disease, and starvation. The alliance with indigenous nations, above all the Wampanoag leader Massasoit, whose knowledge of the land was the only reason any colonist survived at all. And finally, the harvest feast the following autumn, later mythologized into the origin of Thanksgiving. Even in this first chapter, the American story already reveals its central technique. It takes an ambiguous, often desperate history, reliant entirely on indigenous goodwill, marked by disease and death, riddled with internal disputes over authority, and reshapes it into an inspirational parable about faith, unity, and self-rule. This was not the only English colony, nor the first. Jamestown, Virginia, founded in 1607, 13 years before Plymouth, was a colder and more commercial affair. A corporate venture chartered to extract profit for London investors, not a pilgrimage of the pious. Its early years were marked by a starvation so severe that colonists resorted to cannibalism, a fact largely absent from the popular telling. Jamestown also planted, in 1619, the seed of an institution that would define the coming centuries more than any Pilgrims compact. The arrival of the first enslaved Africans on North American soil, sold in exchange for provisions. Two founding stories, then, run parallel through the earliest years of English America, one of a community bound by covenant and conscience, the other of a colony built from its first year on coerced labor and the pursuit of profit. American memory chose to foreground the first and quietly bury the second, and the tension between those two inheritances would shape everything that followed. Over the following century, the 13 colonies grew into distinct, often quarrelsome societies, bound to Britain by trade, law, and a shared sense of English identity. Colonists overwhelmingly saw themselves as Englishmen abroad, entitled to the same rights as any subject in London. This is a crucial and often overlooked truth. The American Revolution did not begin as a rebellion against being English. It began as a demand to be treated as English subjects fully. The argument was no taxation without representation, not we are a separate people. Only slowly, through a decade of escalating conflict after 1763, did colonial identity curdle into something distinctly American. The catalyst was debt. Britain emerged from the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, victorious but financially exhausted, having spent a fortune partly to defend its American colonies from French and indigenous forces. Parliament, reasonably from its own perspective, decided the colonies should help shoulder that cost through a series of new taxes: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Colonists, who had grown accustomed to a rough autonomy while Britain was distracted by European wars, experienced these taxes not as reasonable cost-sharing but as an assault on rights they considered inherently theirs as Englishmen. Boston became the epicenter of resistance. In 1770, tensions boiled into violence when British soldiers, jeered and pelted by a crowd, opened fire, killing 5 colonists in what was quickly branded the Boston Massacre. A piece of political theater as much as tragedy, immortalized in an engraving by Paul Revere that exaggerated British aggression for propaganda purposes. It worked. 3 years later, in December 1773, protesters thinly disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of British tea into the water, rather than pay a tax on it. An act of costly, deliberate vandalism now remembered as a noble stand for liberty rather than what it also was: an attack on private property meant to intimidate. Britain's response, the Coercive Acts, quickly renamed the Intolerable Acts by colonial pamphleteers, closed Boston's port and stripped Massachusetts of self-government. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, this drove the colonies together. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies convened in Philadelphia in September 1774 to coordinate resistance. War came within a year, not through grand declaration but through confusion and gunfire at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, when British troops marching to seize a colonial arms cache clashed with local militia. Nobody to this day knows with certainty which side fired the first shot. The shot heard round the world. A phrase coined decades later by the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, not by any witness on the scene. It took more than a year of fighting before the colonies formally declared independence. This delay matters and is frequently smoothed over. Many colonists, including prominent leaders, hoped well into 1776 for reconciliation with Britain, not separation. It was only after the Second Continental Congress had been managing a war for over a year, and after Thomas Paine's blistering pamphlet Common Sense reframed monarchy itself as an absurdity, that independence became the dominant colonial position. On July 4, 1776, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, largely drafted by a 33-year-old Virginia planter named Thomas Jefferson, who owned over 600 human beings across his lifetime while writing that all men are created equal and endowed with an unalienable right to liberty. This contradiction was not lost on contemporaries. The English writer Samuel Johnson had already asked pointedly, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" But it would take nearly 90 years and a catastrophic civil war before the nation seriously confronted it. The war itself, contrary to its heroic retelling, was a desperate and frequently losing affair. George Washington, appointed commander of the Continental Army, lost more battles than he won. His army nearly dissolved from cold, hunger, and desertion during the winter of 1777–78 at Valley Forge, saved in part by the training of a Prussian-born officer, Baron von Steuben, who drilled the ragged colonial forces into something resembling a professional army. American victory, when it finally came, was not primarily a triumph of homegrown virtue over British tyranny. It depended enormously on foreign intervention. France, eager to weaken its imperial rival Britain, poured in money, weapons, and, decisively, its navy, whose blockade of Chesapeake Bay in 1781 trapped the British Army under Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown and forced its surrender. Spain and the Dutch Republic also aided the American cause, directly or indirectly. The American Revolution, in other words, was as much a chapter in European great power rivalry as it was a spontaneous uprising of colonial patriots, a detail the national narrative, built around self-reliant frontier virtue, has always been reluctant to foreground. Victory secured, the new nation immediately confronted the fact that its wartime government, A loose confederation of sovereign states under the Articles of Confederation could not function in peacetime. It could not tax, could not regulate trade between states, could not put down internal unrest effectively, as demonstrated by Shays' Rebellion in 1786–87, when indebted Massachusetts farmers took up arms against what they saw as an unresponsive state government. Alarmed elites, merchants, lawyers, planters, convened in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, ostensibly to revise the Articles, and instead wrote an entirely new charter of government in secret, closed-door sessions, sworn to confidentiality so that debates could occur frankly without public pressure. The result, the United States Constitution, was a document of genuine and radical political innovation. A republic of divided powers, checks and balances, elected representation on a scale never before attempted for a territory so vast. It was also a document of enormous, deliberate compromise. To secure the participation of Southern states, it enshrined the institution of slavery directly into its structure, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation, giving slaveholding states outsized political power precisely because they held human beings as property, while guaranteeing federal assistance in recapturing escaped enslaved people and forbidding any restriction on the international slave trade for at least 20 years. The Constitution that Americans venerate as the blueprint of liberty was, from its first draft, also a blueprint for the perpetuation of bondage, a fact essential to understanding everything that followed in the 19th century. The mythologizing of this era began almost immediately and quite deliberately. The founding generation itself understood they were writing history as they made it, and moved swiftly to control how it would be remembered. George Washington, keenly aware of his symbolic weight, cultivated an image of Roman-style civic virtue, refusing a crown, voluntarily relinquishing power after 2 presidential terms, an act his contemporaries compared to the ancient Roman general Cincinnatus returning to his plow. This restraint was genuinely significant. In an age when successful revolutionary generals routinely became dictators, Washington's voluntary departure set a precedent that held for over a century. But the polishing went further than restraint alone. Early biographers, most famously Mason Locke Weems, fabricated stories entirely. The cherry tree, the silver dollar thrown across the Potomac, to render Washington not merely a skilled leader but a moral paragon, essentially a secular saint, useful to a young nation that needed unifying symbols more than it needed complicated truths. By the early 19th century, the Founding Fathers had been transformed in popular memory from a fractious, often bitterly divided group of political operators, men who slandered each other in partisan newspapers, who nearly came to blows in Congress, whose disagreements over federal power versus states' rights would eventually help produce civil war, into a unified pantheon of wise, prophetic architects who had somehow foreseen and intended everything that followed. Textbooks written for the common schools that spread across America in the 1820s through 1850s did not merely teach the facts of the Revolution. They taught it as a providential drama, a story in which God himself had guided the founding, in which American liberty was not one experiment in self-government among many but the fulfillment of a divine plan stretching back to the Pilgrims. This was the birth of what historians now call American exceptionalism. Not simply pride in national achievement, common to every nation, but the specific claim that the United States occupies a unique moral position in world history, exempt from the ordinary rise and fall that governs other nations, because its founding was not merely political but sacred. This sacred framing did enormous cultural work. It allowed a nation built partly on slavery and the displacement of indigenous peoples to understand itself as a beacon of freedom. It allowed a rebellion that succeeded largely through French intervention to understand itself as a triumph of self-reliant frontier virtue. It transformed landowning elites debating tax policy behind closed doors into philosopher kings communing with the eternal principles of liberty. None of this required deliberate deception at every step. Much of it was sincere belief, reinforced generation after generation through schoolbooks, monuments, and civic ritual, until the myth and the memory became functionally the same thing. By the time of the Civil War, competing sections of the same country would each claim the Founding Fathers and the Constitution as ultimately supporting their side. The North insisting the Founders intended liberty to expand toward all people, the South insisting the Founders had protected property, including human property, as an inviolable right. Both readings could find support in the same 18th century document, because that document, like the founding story built around it, had never been as unified or as clean as the legend demanded. What emerges from an honest look at this period is not a story of a nation less remarkable than its myth suggests, but one considerably more complicated, more contingent, and in some ways more impressive precisely because it was not preordained. Independence was won by a divided, frequently mismanaged colonial coalition, rescued repeatedly by foreign powers pursuing their own interests, led by men who were brilliant political theorists and, in many cases, slaveholders whose stated principles and lived practices stood in open contradiction. The nation's founding document was a masterpiece of Republican engineering and a compromise with human bondage in the same breath. And the clean, providential version of this story that generations of Americans would be taught was not simply history. It was a chosen memory, assembled deliberately across the decades that followed, to give a young and uncertain republic something to believe in. That process of choosing, polishing, and mythologizing a usable past would not stop with the Revolution. It would repeat in different forms at every major turning point still to come, and it is that recurring pattern, the machinery of American memory itself, that the chapters ahead will follow west across a continent, through a war fought over the very contradiction planted at the founding, and into the century when America would tell its story not just to itself, but to the entire world.